Okay. Hi, Mark. Um, okay. Um, we'll give it a minute, so I don't have to keep looking at the waiting room, at the wait room. Um, that looks like okay. Looks like that's where we are. Um, okay. So everyone should please mute themselves unless you're talking. There will be lots of time, I hope, for questions. I hope it'll be somewhat more discussion than I usually do on online. Sure, have been. I'll just say for a moment, this is going to be a little bit different than the usual share in this because I don't have a regular source sheet. The reason I don't have a regular source sheet is that almost all of the Mikvaot are going to be either websites or PDFs. So I apologize. One of the PDFs particularly is going to be awkward because it seems to have been badly done, and so the pages are every second page is in reverse order. Somebody put and it didn't, the PDF didn't come out well, so it'll be a little bit more difficult to follow the source sheet than usual, and I apologize for that in advance. Hopefully the content will be clear. Okay, this is the second in a series. So I want to spend a little bit of time reviewing reviewing the first the content of the first year. I haven't fixed the recording up well enough yet, so it hasn't been posted yet. But here's what we did in the first year. We did in the first year we discussed the position of Rabbi David Miller, who is the author of a work called The Secret of the Jew. We'll meet him again today. Who was the most prominent advocate of tap water mikvot in the United States between 19 and we thought about the first edition of Rabbi Miller's English book. He had a Yiddish book that preceded it called The Secret of the Jew, came out in 1930, and we went through what was actually in that book. We'll go through it again at the beginning of today. What I established, I hope, in the first year was that I started from the introduction of Rabbi Nathan Kamenetsky to Dr. Yitzchak Frank's grammar for Gemara, in which he claims that Rabbi Miller's advocated mikvaot that were so small that people immersing them would violate Isurei Karet on the basis of a grammatical error in the Rambam. What I showed last week is that Rabbi Miller made no such grammatical error, and that the entire thing is a mare's nest because it's a grammatical error based on what is actually a wrong text in the Rambam. But even if you had that text, the text has only one possible meaning, and Ray Miller got it right. There's really no issue about that. And if Ray Miller had gotten it wrong, it wouldn't have been for grammatical reasons, right? For all of those ways, it was an urban legend that Ray Miller's position was based on a grammatical error. What I said, though, which is going to be important, we're going to continue that today, is that the claim that Ray Miller used a too small shear on the basis of a reading was implausible anyway, because the standard measure of a mikveh is given as a volume in the Talmud, and the simplest measurement of it is it has to be at least big enough for an ordinary person to fully immerse themselves, and in practice, to fulfill the mitzvah of mikveh, you have to be able to fully immerse yourself simultaneously. And so probably any position that enables a person, any size body of water that enables a person to fully immerse themselves is probably a plausible size, and otherwise, and no reading can change that. Secondly, we pointed out that the volume is given in amot, and there's a range of positions in history as to what the size of an amma is, and we saw the positions of whether maybe the size of an amma in fact changes over time. Maybe it's subject to your local population, maybe it's subject to historical number. There are all sorts of ways in which an amma can change, but basically it varies between 18 and 24 inches. And Ray Miller, in his original version in 1930, used a 24-inch amma, so his size was in fact massive. So where did this whole thing start? So we showed last week that in 1938, Ray Miller issued a revised edition of his work. He maintained publishing all the previous approbations he had received, but actually he changed the book, and he acknowledges in the revision that he did not receive any approbations for the revision, although he claimed that nobody had come up with a conclusive disproof. In the revision, Rabbi Miller lowered the required volume of mikveh from 177 gallons to, in his position, somewhere in the 80s, although he acknowledges that the Aruch HaShulchan, which many people recommend to use instead, leaves it about 117 gallons. So what I suggested was that the attack on Rabbi Miller was based on the 1938 edition, and how that would come out, we really don't know, because because Rabbi Miller died in 1939, so he didn't really have time to defend himself. And what happened was that when the movement against tap water mikvaot began in the United States in the late 1940s or early 50s, so then it was a convenient bugaboo to claim that Rabbi Miller's argument for tap water mikvaot was also an argument for bathtub mikvaot. And since, in fact, at the end, Rabbi Miller had advocated a volume of only 80-something gallons, you could see how that could conceivably be a bathtub mikveh. However, the reality is that all editions of Rabbi Miller's book had a chapter in them entitled "A Bathtub is Not a Mikveh," in which he says very clearly that a bathtub is not a mikveh, and we'll have to look at it and explain why. All Rabbi Miller's advocacy was always for building an additional mikveh in your house in addition to the bathtub, and we'll have to try and figure out whether that was a function of his immediate circumstances or whether that is something that's maintained all the way throughout. What is clear, what is clear is that in the United States, right, among the positions that are normally cited as Orthodox positions in the United States in the early 20th century, tap water mikvaot were a very common option. And in fact, tap water mikvaot have been approved recently. I think it's the case recently in Canada, where tap water mikvah was approved with general Orthodox consensus. But that did not in any way mean bathtub mikvaot, because bathtubs were bathtubs were invalid according to Rabbi Miller, and so far as I know, no one disagreed with him actively. At the very least, because of size, and even Rabbi Miller shifts his position to only 80 gallons, which is still way more than the average bathtub you could imagine fitting into a jacuzzi. He still maintained the chapter saying that bathtub mikvot were invalid. Maybe he didn't know about bathtubs that big. Maybe his bathtubs were different than ours. I argued that probably Rabbi Miller held, and I think it's a reasonable position, that a mikveh not only has to hold that body of water, it has to hold that body of water and not lose any of that water when the person fully immerses. So it has to be not just the size of 40 sa'ah, it has to be the size of 40 sa'ah plus the volume of a person, and it has to not lose any of the 40 sa'ah when the person immerses, which means it can't have an overflow valve either. Right? If the water rises to the level of the overflow valve, so then according to Rabbi Miller, the mikveh is possible, and it seems very unlikely, I think, that even certainly private jacuzzis reach the level where you can immerse yourself fully and no water, right? And no water, right? And no water goes out the overflow tank, and that might be, for reasons we'll see in a moment, it might be that even if you had enough volume in it, might be that the overflow valve would be an issue anyway. Okay, that's basically our summary from last time. Okay, I want to do a brief introduction now. I didn't do that last time because last time I was really just interested in the reading of the text. I want to do a very, very brief introduction to Hilchot Mikvaot and what one needs in a mikveh, with the qualifier that I really am not in any way even a minimal expert in Hilchot Mikvaot, so I apologize if I make errors and everything I say will be oversimplified. For the purpose of this shir, it shouldn't make so much difference, but you're welcome to correct me in the chat if I make obvious errors. Okay, so there are basically two kinds of kosher mikvaot. One is what halachically is called a ma'ayan, which is a mikveh formed from groundwater, and the other is called a mikveh. The difference between them is that a mikveh formed from what's called spring water, or ma'ayan, can be flowing, right? Which means that water can have an outlet as well as an inlet, whereas a mikveh, water that's defined as a mikveh, which for our purposes will mean anything other than a ma'ayan, meaning that it certainly includes rainwater. It might include melted ice, or at least natural ice that has melted, maybe artificial ice that's melted. That's an entirely separate conversation. And if you think tap water is fine, it might include tap water. But all of those have to be still water, as opposed to what's called zochalin, running water, which means it can't have an outlet beyond the specified what the definition of outlet is itself controversial. Because of this, and again, you have to get into issues of where how halacha thinks, or where halacha thinks water comes from, which some of you may know in the Gemara is it's challenging to figure out where the Gemara comes from, but where the Gemara thinks water comes from. But the reason that we are resistant to some extent to natural, to people being tovil in natural. Sorry, I'm going to get to the right screen share in a minute. Natural water is that there's a risk that the water might be. So I don't have the right one, but there's a risk that the water might be. There's a risk that the water might be rainwater, and therefore, therefore there's a risk that if you're dealing with rainwater, that it has an outlet and it shouldn't have an outlet. Right? So those are the reasons that we prefer that people not use natural mikvaot if they have a choice. Okay. Right, other issues, right? So that's why we have a preference for constructed mikvaot as opposed to natural mikvaot. Although everyone understands that natural mikvaot are kosher, assuming they meet the right requirements. Okay, that is the second thing, which is that we all agree that halacha, we'll talk about on what basis, that a mikvah can't be defined as water that is she'uvin. She'uvin is water that is drawn. But so everyone agrees that on some level you can't have a mikvah that is drawn. However, there is the definition of drawn is not obvious. It could be that tap water is not considered drawn, and that's what one of the big issues is. Secondly, everyone agrees that the mikvah itself cannot be defined halachically as a utensil. Right? So the question is, what's defined as utensil? So utensil is usually defined as a portable, for our purposes, as a portable object that can hold water. The challenges are going to be the definition of portability. Is it a question of weight? Is it a question of how it's affixed to the wall? And the definition of holding water, because obviously bathtubs hold water if you have a plug in them. So the question is, at what point does it have to be built with the intention to plug it as does it have to be plugged by the ground? All sorts of ways in which the definition of utensil can be bothersome in the context of the mikvah itself. And then there's the possibility that if the mikvah has ever been through something that is considered, the water's ever been through something that's considered a kli, so then that is also invalid. And that's a little bit more challenging because the definition of a kli for our purposes is that it contains water in its natural position of use, which means that if you have let's say a tank, and water goes through the tank, but the outlet is above the bottom, right? If there's a drain in the bottom, so everyone understands that in its natural condition, this container does not hold water because it has a hole in the bottom, assuming that you think that the drain is not, that the plug of the drain is not integral, or is part of the ground, however you handle that. But the challenge is that in water systems, it may be that you have a tank with an outlet which is above ground level, and in that case, at least the part of the tank below the hole is a kli, and that could be a grave difficulty. Okay, so we also said that a mikveh has to have 40 sa'ah, is measured as 40 sa'ah, but we're not going to try and figure out what the volume is what the liquid volume is directly. We have a measurement. The measurement is 1 amah by 1 amah by 3 amot. And the minimal thing, if you took the minimal amount of 18 inches, that would still get you 80 gallons. If you take the maximum measurement, it gets you about 177 gallons. all that is way above the size of the average bathtub. So the two things you should know is that once you have a kosher mikveh of whatever sort with the appropriate kind of water, so then you can connect it, right? That's how our mikvot are built. You can connect it to a different container which has puzzle water, and as long as we have something called hashaka, which connect right that the other water is added to an already kosher mikveh, and the connection is maintained. So you can, right? That's how we handle it. That's how everyone agrees that our mikvaot are in practice filled with tap water for sanitary reasons, but the original kosher mikveh is protected and maintained. And there's also a position that there's something called hamshacha, which might mean that even if you had water that was originally invalid because it had been in a kli, that you can have it before it goes into your mikveh, you can have it go undergo a process of being led, which will make it kosher. All right, and that's so many tap water mikvot designs were designed to account for the possibility that the water had been in a utensil, and then do something about the lead-in that would be sufficient. That would be sufficient to remove it. And then the question is whether the piping of a house is ever sufficient to accomplish that. Very likely not. So very likely, if the water has been in a kli, then ordinary house piping will not be sufficient to make it kosher, even if you don't require rainwater. You think tap water was sufficient, and but if the tap water has actually been in a utensil, so then you would need some way to make it kosher afterwards. Okay, that is our basic introduction. I'm going to share my screen now, and I'm going to try and assume I will get this right. I'm going to try to get us to Rabbi Miller directly, so we can see where Rabbi Miller started. Okay, so here's Rabbi Miller, and you can see Rabbi Miller tells you that he's by vocation a builder. This is the 1930 edition, but other than the size, really nothing changes between 1930 and 1938. Right, so Rabbi Miller says, right, he criticizes people who are tufrim, and right, unfounded theories dictated by excessive piety do not help in upholding the cause of tefillah. There is uncalled for obstacles. Rabbi Miller really didn't like chumras, and he's particularly upset at people who thought that water meters were considered kalim, and therefore tap water was invalid. He has a whole long, detailed description of why water meters are not kalim, and therefore the water coming through water meters doesn't invalidate his home mikvahs. But here are the two issues that do matter to us most. One is, he says, water tanks installed in the course of the supply of water or on tops of buildings to regulate the supply or in pressure are not classed as vessels and utensils, and do not disqualify the water conveyed by or through them from mikvah. Great. But now he has conditions. He says, provided, however, that such tanks were originally made to be connected to the ground or a building. Okay, that's requirement one. That's probably pretty easy to meet. That they are in fact connected thereto, that's fine, and permanently installed. So now a question of what permanently installed means. Bathtubs are installed. Are they permanently installed? They can be moved, but probably they're permanently installed, especially if they're not just sitting on the floor. Right, clawfoot tubs may not be as permanently installed, but maybe being affixed to the plumbing is sufficient. And provided, of course, that they have a hole in the very bottom, which is usually the case as an outlet. Okay, so the question there is, how do the tanks in water systems, whether in the city or in private houses, do they have holes in the very bottom as outlets? Okay, and he tells you how you could accomplish that. Right, that's not our issue. Right, then he tells you that he doesn't care about any of these objects, provided, however, of course, right, that any of these apparatus is not capable of holding water in its original position, and before being connected or attached. That's a big question, and it's made originally for that purpose. So is it true that all the objects in a standard water system are not capable of holding water in the original position? Okay, so he ends up saying it's fine that all water intended for public use is private. Although he has an additional requirement as to how the water comes to the mikveh or through a rubber hose from the faucet. That's what he does. Hamshacha without any assistance of man while in the course of conveyance. Right, that's a issue that's not going to matter for very much. And then he says water from private water supplies conveyed to an elevated storage tank can be used for the mikveh, assuming again that it's all those rules, right? So Rabbi Miller basically tells you that he thinks that tap water is fine. He thinks that there's almost nothing that can make the tap water invalid for the mikveh, as long as everything meets these three rules, of which the most important rule is that it cannot at any process in the stage be in a container that holds water in its natural position. Okay, so now there's a book by Rabbi Telushkin, who was apparently a major Chabad figure, who people often cite as as probably the most prominent halachic figure who endorses Rabbi Miller's work. And here's what he says, and this is in fact I think an excellent description of what Rabbi Miller talks about. He says that there are two kinds of issues that. All right, so Rabbi Telushkin went out to actually investigate municipal water systems. Rabbi Miller claimed that he had done so in his areas, but Rabbi Telushkin went out to reinvestigate all the water systems, and he discovered that there were a whole variety of issues in addition to those discussed by Rabbi Miller that you could see as problems. One of them is called Gigiot Bekarka. What happens if the municipal water supply is held in storage tanks before being delivered to the people? And the storage tanks do not have outlets in the bottom. They're often, right, they're run by water pressure, and they're horizontal. So both the inlets and the outlets are above the bottom level of the mikveh. So he says that they're right. He says here. So he's talking about New York. He says Kamur la'el ostalid mishtamshim b'shlosha mekamot b'New York b'gigiot hatzmunot bekarka pressure tanks. And he explains how pressure tanks work. I am utterly incompetent at explaining the hydraulics to you, but he explains you how they work. And he says that these storage tanks are used in Highland Park in East New York, Forest Hills in Queens, and Riverdale in the right at the western edge of the Bronx. Okay, and he says that there is a yesh reshima shlema. There's a complete list of all the streets that are supplied from those tanks, and he gives you a place where you can get the locations where you can develop, you can acquire maps of these places. And he says b'chol ofen tzarich lahotzi shchunot halalu michlal heter. He says that when I say that tap water is fine for mikvahs in New York, I mean that except for those neighborhoods. Okay, so in order to understand what's going on here, we have to say when he allowed tap water, so the allowance of tap water is theoretical because there's nothing wrong with water drawn from reservoirs. And now going back, that's probably assuming that reservoirs are demonstrably mostly filled by what is halachically considered groundwater, as opposed to what's halachically considered rainwater. Because you might have a problem of zochalin if it's filled by rainwater. I haven't seen that issue raised. I'm assuming that it's largely true that municipal water systems are not filled by what halacha calls rainwater, but I wouldn't assume that. But even in places where we know that halachically the vast majority of it comes from groundwater, he says, but sometimes it's transferred through tanks. And Rabbi Telushkin himself says that where the water was held in such tanks, you have to exclude them from the heter, although in footnote 2, he has an explanation of how it is conceivably you could defend even the pressure tanks, but he thinks that you should not use this, and he does not recommend it at all. Okay, right, so that's where we are now, is that everyone, right, is that Rabbi Miller and Rabbi Telushkin in principle allow tap water, but Rabbi Miller sets up a series of theoretical frameworks that you would have to check in the case of your tap water. Rabbi Telushkin says he has checked this in the case of the municipal water supply in New York, and he knows there are at least 3 neighborhoods where this is not the case. Okay, so now we're moving to contemporary. Most recently, I would say there are 2 figures in public who have advocated the use of bathtub mikvaot, and the use of bathtub mikvaot requires 2 stages. One is 3 stages really. You have to legitimate the original water supply, the municipal water supply. Secondly, you have to legitimate the specific water supply in the house or neighborhood at every level that is supplying the bathtub. And then thirdly, you have to decide whether the bathtub itself is not a kli and is large enough to be a mikveh. So Rabbi Ovadia, in his argument, Rabbi Chaim Ovadia, in his argument for Bathtub Mikvaot, quotes a paper from Rabbi Azos about the Seattle mikvah system, an excellent paper, and he tells and he correctly frames the issue. And here is where you can where he identifies Rabbi Teleshkin identify underground pressurized holding tanks. Rabbi Teleshkin identified 3 such tanks in New York City. With them, he conceded that Mikvaot should not be filled with water fed from such tanks, and even listed the streets that marked the border between where city water was fed from these tanks and those from upstate reservoirs. Okay, so if we were to allow, right, so now let's suppose that we are now in the position where somebody is asking us, because of the coronavirus epidemic, can we use bathtub mikvaot? And the first question that we have to ask is, do we accept tap water? We're not going to suddenly fill our bathtubs with rainwater. And so the answer, I think, clearly is that tap water, in theory, is permitted, but the question is whether tap water in practice is permitted. So we've already seen that there are 3 places where tap water is not necessarily permitted. So now what I want to do is, I hope that this is the right source. I want to show you what the Cleveland water system was. I should have had this link open. Actually, how the Cleveland water system is developed. I just picked Cleveland randomly because I knew it couldn't have the same kind of water supply as New York. And let's take a look at how Cleveland distributes its water. Okay, so if you look at Cleveland's map, you'll see that Cleveland is utterly different than New York. What Rabbi Teleshkin and Miller both tell you is that in New York, all the water comes from upstate and it flows down by gravity. Rabbi Teleshkin has a very detailed description of the places where that's not true, as we saw. But that's basically the fundamental system. So the water is handled very differently than in New York than in Cleveland, where the water has to be brought uphill from Lake Erie. And if you look at the way they show it, they show you a series of pumps with outlets above their basic level. These are all the stages of water treatment in Cleveland, right? Because all the water has to be pumped, and it has to be pumped in different kinds of devices than in New York. And if you take a look further, you look at a more detailed description of the Cleveland water system. So here's their water treatment model, and here again you can see that they present it as a series of tanks, and the first 4 series, the first four levels of it are all tanks that have outlets above the base level. So you have to know how these tanks are built, right? But on the surface, it seems to me that each of these are problematic in Rabbi Teleshkin's terms. And I want to just state this, not again because I don't know this, and maybe each of these has independent ways of being addressed halachically. But the notion that you can move directly from Rabbi Miller's work, let alone and Rabbi Teleshkin's work, to say, well, now we can just straightforwardly permit bathtub mikvaot, I think is inaccurate, because you have to check the reality. I'm going to talk about a couple other things in terms of reality. Rabbi Miller talks about 2 kinds of pumps that are used, and he explains why each of these are not considered to be halachically kelim. But guess what? We don't use either of those sorts of pumps. So somebody has to go investigate whether the new kinds of pumps used in water systems are the same. When Rabbi Miller talks about rooftop tanks, he assumes that they're all built in place in cities as opposed to pre-existing parts. He doesn't deal with household hot water tanks, and each of these, the reality has changed. If you look, I think, at most of our hot water tanks, their outlet is not in the bottom, and I think that safety designs require there to be water left in the tank. New York City, apparently, for apartment building storage tanks on top, required that they always be left somewhat full, because that way fire departments could always have water when they got to them. So it seems to me that there is a long way to go from any, not, I don't know what the outcome is, but to say that because in the 1930s and 40s people published books in which they legitimated tap water, therefore if we can solve the bathtub problem we can go directly to back to those heterim, is not the case. You have to go back and investigate each municipal water system. Particularly New York is an exceptional system, I believe, in that so much of its water is distributed by gravity as opposed to by other means. It would be different, I think, if you had a, right, so Lake Erie is still considered groundwater halachically, but if you had a place where everything was fed by runoff from the mountains, that might be an entirely different halachic problem. So I don't really understand how somebody could claim that you can move directly to bathtub mikvaot, even assuming you could solve all the problems with bathtub mikvaot on the basis of tap water, when it seems to me that all the precedents about tap water actually actually required us to do a great deal of investigation. So that's stage one, and that's pretty much where I am with. I guess that's Rabbi Chaim Ovadia seems to, from what I can tell, to have advocated bathtub jacuzzi mikvaot, claiming particularly that jacuzzis are big enough. I'm not sure they're big enough, even by Rabbi Miller's final notion, let alone by the Aruch HaShulchan's notion. But even if it were true that they were big enough, and even if you assume that all the problems of Kalim have been removed, I don't understand how you can make an absolute claim about this without investigating the details of both the general and the specific water supplies. Okay, I'm going to stop the share for a moment, and okay. Apparently, I did not show a particular links. I apologize if I didn't do that. You can all look up the Cleveland water supply if that's the link I didn't show. And Nathan Casimir says, right, yeah. So you're right that if that one of the things Ray Miller says is that if your water is flowing directly from the reservoir, right, and there's a direct connection, so now you've created hashaka because there was a kosher reservoir, and now your water is being connected to that reservoir. The challenge is that assumes that there are no valve cutoffs between you and the water at some point. That there isn't a holding tank that actually where the water is actually stopped, and so there isn't a direct connection. So again, you have to investigate, even assuming that that heter works, that all the water flowing through, right? You have to assume it's not in a kli in the middle, and that, right, or even if you think it could flow through a kli, that the valve there isn't shut off. So again, it might be true, right? Miller argues that it's true in many cases, but I think it's more likely to be true in New York than in other places, because in New York, again, you're using a gravity pressure-driven system, so there's no motive to have the water stop at any point, and you have to investigate it specifically. Okay, so are there questions people want to ask at this stage before? Right, that's basically my discussion of what I think is the public American claim, which I understand have been made by Rabbi Chaim Ovadia, that we can right now directly use bathtub mikvaot. And again, the summary is bathtubs, that Ray Miller isn't the precedent. Ray Miller opposed bathtubs at the very least because he thought they weren't big enough. Probably certainly they're not big enough by the larger shear. Probably there aren't any bathtubs big enough by even by the Aruch HaShulchan's shear. Probably there aren't any bathtubs even big enough for Ray Miller's shear, Ray Miller's final shear, because you have to add your own displacement of water. And those are leaving aside the questions of any technical questions about bathtubs. Ray Miller may have had other issues with bathtubs in terms of whether they're clear or not, and that I'm not vouching for. But that even if you solved all the size issues, and even if you think that tap water is in principle okay, you really have to investigate the details in every case in order to pull this off, unless you're going to try something separate, which is you're creating hamshacha from the tap in every case, but then you require specific instructions. You can't just let people fill their bathtubs. And again, I would point out again that no matter how big a bathtub is, the overflow valve is a problem. So we can instruct people to block their overflow valves, which might be a safety issue, right? But all those are complicated issues. You can't just tell people to immerse in their bathtubs. And my own sense is that private home hot water heaters are often going to be a major issue. So it might be that even in the best case scenario where all the other issues were solved, you would still have to tell people they can only use cold water. I don't understand. I honestly don't understand how one can make a straightforward statement that women can go to mikveh in a bathtub in the United States and then go home and resume relationships with their husband without any concern that they are violating a prohibition of karet. The argument, as in those terms, doesn't work for me. But we'll see in the second half of the year that there's a suggestion in Israel which is very different. Okay, questions. Okay, no questions. We'll take the we'll go on to, we'll take on the rest of the shir. Okay.
Hold on just a
Yeah,
sec.
sure.
Could you just mention review just very briefly again why there's a preference against natural mikvaot?
Because only groundwater mikvaot are allowed to be what's considered zochlin running water. So and you don't really know where the water comes from in lots of natural mikvaot, whether halachically, whether it's considered to be groundwater or rainwater. So there are complicated.
So okay, so why okay, but obviously for our constructed mikvaot, rainwater is preferred. So why is there a difference between natural and constructed in that regard?
Because our constructed mikvaot don't have outlets, so there's no possibility that they're invalid because they're zochelin.
Right? Okay, so if you had a natural mikvah which did not have an outlet,
yes.
So what about the Dead Sea?
Not
that you'd want it, but
yeah. So that if you check it out and discover that you're natural, that you have a real classical mikvah, which is just a pit full of rainwater and it has no outlet, then that's kosher.
Okay, then what about the ocean?
Right, all those questions are discussed. Sure, but probably those are all in principle valid. There are separate questions that people are concerned about modesty issues and people want to immerse themselves. There are other reasons that people prefer deliberately constructed mikvot to natural mikvos, but those are almost certainly only lichatchila issues, as opposed, right? They're not really concerns of a possibility of invalidity. They're just really good. They're policy issues, as opposed to the other concern, which is really there's a real risk that right. Even if you did everything right yourself, you're in something which doesn't work.
Right. So if you decide to sequester yourself on a yacht that's out in the ocean, right, that may not be so bad in this regard.
Yes.
At night.
Yeah. All right.
And no sharks.
Right, and and then figure out how somebody, who checks to make sure that you're fully immersed, right? Well, if you dive 100 feet under, unless you're Rapunzel, you probably got all your hair underneath. Right, but if but you have to make sure that you go deeper than the length of your hair, right? Because it's not likely that somebody standing over the yacht can really tell you're fully immersed unless they have a spotlight, which raises, again, hope there's nobody else around, right? You understand why there are good policy reasons that we much prefer, building mikvaot to natural mikvaot, but natural mikvaot in principle certainly work. The only issue is that that unless it's just a hole, it's hard to tell. Right, it's hard to tell exactly what the source comes from, especially since the halachic conceptions of the source of water may not match the contemporary geological conceptions. Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, so let's move on to part two. Part two is that in Israel, a similar suggestion was made by Rabbi Chaim Amsalem. He put out he initially responded to a query on Facebook, and then he published something on his site, the Zera Yisrael site, which is famous because of one of his earlier works called Zera Yisrael about patrilineal descent. Right, so he put out a book called no, not the right one. Sorry, he put out. I keep on doing the wrong. A book called Uvacharta B'Chaim. Right, that's this, and right, this is his defense of bathtub mikvaot in Israel. So I want to show you how different this is from Rabbi Chaim Ovadia's explanation, and we'll talk about whether this is a good idea, a good idea or not. So we're gonna have to do it based on my share as opposed to his, because I don't think the size is enough to watch. But the problem is when they PDF'd it, they really just did a terrible job, and so it's on their site again. Every second page is backwards, and when you PDF it, it gets worse. And you see the pages don't match the pages, and everything is backwards. But we're going to do our best. So here is here is Rabbi Chaim Amshalem's psak. So we'll start with the first thing that he says. This is his Havara Chashuva L'Halacha. Okay, so here's what he says. This is the introduction to his psak. Bizmanim ketikunam, when things are as they should be, chayav litbol b'mikvah kasher l'mahadrin, then you have to be tovel in a mikvah which is perfectly kosher. Aval, however, im nimna'a efsharut zu, right? If the possibility of immersing in a mahadrin kosher mikvah is impossible, kimo bizman magefat corona, as for example in our pandemic times, shekola mikvaot ba'olam segurim ba'orot hashiltonot u'mumchei habriot, where all the mikvahs in the world.
You got something right now.
You
get Zoom.
Right, where all the mikvaot in the world are closed by government order and the orders of health experts, because of the danger. And a person sees that he or she is incapable of withstanding the restrictions against intimacy imposed by nida, and you can't go to mikvah. So then the advice is that you should immerse in the manners mentioned in the conclusion of this work, in order to diminish the prohibition. And right then, this is right, a word to the wise, or wink wink, or something like that, right? Really, really very strange. And then it goes further language. This is not a broad heter, right, a complete heter. It's really a hora'at sha'ah, and hora'at sha'ah is formally not a legal ruling at all, but a suspension of the law. And it's a halachic response to the needs of people who are desperate for a solution. Okay, this is Rabbi Amshalem's clarification at the outset of his work. And so the problem is that the facts are false. It's simply not true that all the mikvahs in the world are closed at the order of the governments and health experts. The mikvahs on the whole are open. There are rules, right? If we look at the Oatzot site, we'll see that there are very clear rules about it. Now, there are people, right? People who are highly susceptible, or people are immunosuppressed or themselves sick, are currently strongly advised against going to mikvah for health reasons. If you're sick, you're not allowed to go. That's true. And it's also true that people have legitimate concerns about whether all the protocols required by boards of health are being followed by mikvahs everywhere. And therefore, I think that the consensus across the Orthodox community, I shared the original post by Rabbi Rafi Astroff, the community of Gush Etzion, in which he emphasized that women have the autonomy not to go to mikveh if they feel it's unsafe, and then it was adopted essentially by the RCA. But it's not true that we're in a situation where you can't go to mikveh at all. So maybe this situation is enough because there are, right, we say for those people who are not allowed to go to mikveh, or maybe we think it's not just that you can't go to mikveh, but maybe this psak applies even in circumstances where you just think that it's unsafe to go to mikveh, but his own language is a little bit iffy, about that. And you'll see that the language changes in, as to what exactly is required in a number of places, right? So he says that I wrote this thing at the end of Adar, when there was Asher Hutal Seger Muchlat, when there was an absolute being in place rule. Ein Yotzei ve'ein ba, nobody went in and out. Hashem yamar l'tzorah daya, God should say this is enough. I don't really, that we shouldn't need this psak. Okay, I don't know if there ever was such a time. All right, now he tells you, right, this is a shas hatchak gedola me'od, asher lo chivinu k'motah ba'avar. We've never seen anything like this, so I wanted to try and find a way out. Then he has a lot of rhetoric about how people who keep couples apart even for a night are violating very serious things, and all that is is great and true, but I don't know if that's enough for our purposes. But now he says, Ukvarik damti barosh psak. I already made clear at the beginning of this psak, shepsak ze yetakef rak im yaskimu lo shlosha gedolei Torah. This psak will come into force only if 3 gedolei Torah agree with it. Okay, so now we have to figure out who the gedolei Torah are, right? And so, and does he really mean it? If he really means it, then you'd have to see if they are, right, if three Gedolei Torah in fact agree with him. So he has an introduction from Rabbi Yellow Arbergil, who certainly is a very fine Talmid Chacham. And because at some point Rabbi Arbergil was also the leading scholar who signed the famous Zoom Seder Heter. For what it's worth, and he says, I read Reiti v'yanti b'kuntrus of Acharta b'chayim Masei Yadav shel Rav Gaon, etc. Right, lots of great stuff from Chaim Am Shalem Shlita. B'tshuva l'sheila Yehudim hanimtzeim b'makom she'en lahem mikvah. He says this is he understands as a tshuva written to people who are found in a place where there is no mikvah. V'gam mikvah rachok mimachos cheftzam, and there's no mikvah even close by. I don't know where he got this from. Rabbi Amshel never mentions that as one of his options. Ubifrat ata, right? Even now, when we have this contagious disease, asher behorata malchut niskeru batei knesset v'gam mikvaot, where the government has closed both the batei knesset and the mikvaot. But really, again, so far as I know, we closed the batei knesset, but the mikvahs have not been closed. V'kasher lahem lamod b'nisayon. It says people find it difficult to withstand this test and preserve the rules of Nida. And they're actually not withstanding it. People are violating Hilchot Nida left and right because of this. So he comes and he fishes in the deep seas, and he assembled everything that was written about this. Bivchinat Eitzara, as in a measure for a terrible time. And he brought this for emergency times. Bekama upanim, right, in various ways. Virak zmanit, right, and this is only temporary. Ad yavor zam, until this terrible time passes. Good for him. So it sounds like Rabbi Abershil, in fact, understands Rabbi Shalom's purpose, and he says, I think this is good enough because it's good policy, because right now people aren't withstanding it. So if you're not withstanding it, I agree with Rabbi Shalom, it's better to do it this way than to not do it at all. Okay, so maybe that counts as one of his three. Let's take a look now at the other two people printed in the book itself. Right, he in fact includes three different haskamas. So the next one is from Rabbi Dr. Michal Abraham, who's the head of the Bar Ilan project, who is himself a fascinating figure. I don't think that he would describe himself as one of the Gedolei Torah, but he's certainly a fascinating, brilliant figure with great courage. And so I don't in any way want to minimize it. But let's see what he says. So again, the pages are backwards. This is page 56. We want to get to page 55, which we can't do here. I don't know if we're going to be able to figure out exactly how these pages go together. Where do we get to page 55? This is a mess. Here's 54. I don't think that's it. Okay, let's take a look at page 50 at page 56, and we'll see if we can figure out what he says. This is Dr. Abraham's response. Okay, so here's what he says. He says, "Heter hatvila shetiarti lamala porsam lidei Rav Amshalem b'tshuva ksera shayla b'Facebook." The heter that I described above was published by Rabbi Amsalem in a short tshuva on Facebook. Haheter osek b'matzav shabo ein efshar litbol kedin. It's talking about a case where there's no possibility of being tovel kedin. Right? Maybe at places in Chutz La'aretz, or maybe in the future. Right? He knows full well this has never happened. And the Ram Salam is too hypothetical, even though describes it as something for real. And therefore he says, so he thinks that the critical response of the chief rabbis to Rav Shalom's heter is irrelevant because Rav Shalom's heter was intended for a position which does not exist in Israel or in Chutz La'aretz for that matter, in America for that matter. So Rabbi Abraham's Haskama essentially says it doesn't exist. We have to figure out if it really was intended to be as narrow as he says. All right, because they claim that nowadays there is such a They think there is a possibility of immersing, and now therefore there's no room for heter. But that Rabbi Abraham understands that Rabbi Amshalom agrees that this is only a last resort. Here he says, now Lifnei Kamiyamim, several days ago, Rabbi Amshalom sent me a detailed psak shetaram pursam. So he saw obviously an unpublished draft of Rabbi Amshalom's tshuva. Shabohu masbir b'orach et nimukav, where he explains what he meant in detail. Umasnet the heter b'haskamat poskim nosafim, right? And he conditions his heter on other poskim agreeing with him, and therefore, in his humility, he asked if I was prepared to agree with him. Okay, what is his heter based on? Yesod v'ravhu shepsul shel mikva mayim shuvim. So the ground of Rabbi Amsalam's heter is that the invalidity of a mikveh using tap water, what we call mayim shuvim, gamim kol hamayim shabo shuvim, even if all the water is considered shuvim, larova poskim. Larova poskim hurak midrabanan. Most poskim think that is only a drabanan violation. Yesh losif shashira 40 sa'al data mekilim uka 330 liter mashiyuchol limatzei bambatya gedola o jacuzzi, and he says that the measure of 40 sa'ah, according to the minimal measure, is enough that you can find it in a large bathtub or jacuzzi. I suggested that may not be true. And furthermore, he says that many people say that the water that comes from tap water is kosher anyway, right? So we can use hashaka, and he thinks that our opposition to tap water is only an additional chumrah that people oppose because we have the advantages. Now here he says key line. He says bein heter levein hatza'ah lema'et isurim. He said we have to look at the difference between what's something that is permitted and something that is only intended to say better do fewer prohibitions or lesser prohibitions than actual prohibitions. It says kishikibalti et psakim furachalo. When I received Rabbi Amshalem's detailed psak, katafti, I wrote to him that to the best of my judgment, he is correct on a technical level. But what I said to him is, but I thought it was better to present things differently, and I wanted you to say it, pay attention. This is a substantive difference. Not just a difference of presentation. So I recommended him rather than saying that he's permitting this kind of immersion in an emergency difference. What he's really doing is a way to sin less, as opposed to a way to say it is completely permitted. And if you do it that way, he says, Ze olam acher legamre. This is a completely different world, and I think it would remove the sting from the halachic critiques and return this to a question of midiniyut hilchotiyot, halachic policy. Then he says, Chashuv lavin. It's important to understand that if we had a Beit Din Gadol in our time, they would have they might very well have legislated this. But since we don't have a Beit Din Gadol in our time, he says, there really is an Isur D'Rabbanan, and it's very hard to argue that bathtubs are not a violation do not leave you with an Isur D'Rabbanan of mikveh, because the bathtubs are not big enough according to most positions, and because tap water is not good, certainly according to some positions. And so for those two reasons, the size and the water, it seems to him clear that Rabbi Amshalom has not, in fact, successfully provided a basis for allowing you to immerse in, but rather he's suggesting that if people are incapable of withstanding the test, then we should tell them to do this rather than something else. Okay. So if you look at the rest of Rabbi Amshalem's tshuvas, you'll see that on the whole, actually, we should take a look further. There's Rabbi Butsako writes another of the people who also signed the Zoom Seder Psak. So he has a very different heter. But here's what he says. Even though I'm not fit to, right? I agree with everything Rabbi Shalom said. Since he's demonstrated that the prohibition left of nida to women who immerse in such mikvaot is only drabanan. A heter barur, the leniency is obvious. Of ishat doche kazem makmin al din Torah, and in times like this, we resort to din Torah. Okay, so really there are three kinds of ways in which you can relate this. One is I have demonstrated that this is a valid mikvah, and normally we're just imposing chumras. So that seems to be what Rabbi Shalom said originally, and it sounds like he didn't get anyone really to agree with that. Then the second stage, which is to say that under ordinary circumstances, this is not a b'di'evet situation. In fact, if you do this, this is a violation of the Isur Drabanan. But halakha tells us that in such circumstances, we suspend the halakha Drabanan. So that, Rabbi Abraham says you can't do that. It requires a Sanhedrin to do that. So don't tell people it's a heter. What you're just saying is this policy, this is better than nothing. Whereas Rabbi Bitzako and maybe Rabbi Abergil think that no, actually, you're allowed to suspend Rabbanans even nowadays. Or you can look at right. So maybe one way is that it's completely okay. That doesn't seem to have found any grounding. One way is that it's not just b'diavad. It's normally the husband and wife would be asur d'Rabbanan, but in these circumstances, we're going to say you're not asur d'Rabbanan because rabbis have the power to waive Rabbanans in situations like this. That's the position of Rabbi Butzako. And then there is the Dr. Abraham says it's good policy to tell people this, even though in fact they will still remain asur d'Rabbanan. If you look at the kind of arguments that Rabbi Shalom brings, it seems to me that that Rabbi Abraham is more correct about the nature of his argument than any of the people who were maskim fully. If you look at the kind of he tells you, for example, Hapsak lo no'ad l'tzibur charidi hanishma l'rabanin machmirin isurin. He says, right, I'm not writing this for people who would keep the halacha. I'm writing this for people who won't keep the halacha anyway, right? So for charidim, I'm not going to do it. And if you look at all the grounds that he presents for it, he has a list of this is dizzying, a list of grounds for his heter. So he says the Torah was not given to angels. You can't issue a decree on the Sibur that they can't withstand. You can't make decrees which are impossible to keep. All those are secondary grounds. The most radical version he has is over here on page 9. This is Rabbi Shalom, not Rabbi Abraham. It compares it astonishingly to the case. I wish I could find it here. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble. The case famously Rabbi Eloi, who says that if a man finds himself incapable of here we are, right? He says that Rabbi Eloi says if a person finds himself incapable of controlling their sexual urges, they should go to a place that they don't recognize him and wear black and do what his heart wishes and not be mechal Shem Shemayim Efarhesia. So we can talk about whether that Gemara really means it or whether, which some Rishonim think that's really what you should do if you can't control your sexual urges, at least do it in private. And what other Rishonim hold, like the Rif and the Rush, is that you can't do this. It's just a trick to, it's a way these are processes which might get you to control your impulses. And even if he tells you that this is what you should do, he's obviously not telling you this is a good thing to do. He's just telling you it's better than the alternative. So it sounds like Rabbi Shalem is really saying this. So here's where I would summarize, and then I'll take questions. It seems to me that at this stage, there is no one who argues that really that bathtub mikvaot are kosher to remove the iser of nida deoraisa. Of nida derabanan. There is a very plausible argument, probably the majority argument, that tap water mikvaot are at least enough to get rid of the isur deoraita. There are technicalities which might prevent them from working anyway, and it's not clear that anybody has done the investigation in the United States. It's clear that nobody has done the investigation in the United States to make sure that that's not an issue with bathtub mikvaot. I don't know whether Rabbi Shalom had done. Israel has a single water supply, so it'd be much easier to investigate. I think he should still have been clear, even with his own issue about whether you could turn on the hot water. He should have what your household's water supply is, how you measure the volume of your mikveh, how you deal with the overflow valve. I don't. So in short, I don't like the psak, but maybe in Israel you could do better investigations than it. But everyone, even Rabbi Amshalom, it seems to me, has to at the end concede that um, that no standard halacha, no other posek has acknowledged the argument that his mikvah that toveling your home removes the derabanan prohibition. And the only question is it right? Do we tell people to violate in mikvaot that are kosher deoraisa but not derabanan? And that Dr. Abraham says, well, we tell people because it's good policy, even though they'll still be asur. Rabbi Butzako says we tell people, and it becomes halacha because we told them that. Underlying the question is, under what circumstances can you issue a heter like this? So Dr. Abraham claims that Rabbi Shalom described himself as talking about a circumstance where generally all the mikvot are closed. That circumstance is a fiction. It didn't happen. Whether even he would apply it. So if it's a question of telling people, look, if you're going to have relations anyway, you might as well do this. So then I think his psak probably would apply even in cases where it's not a complete closure, but there are people who won't go to the regular mikveh. But if it's an argument that we as a policy measure should waive it, as Rabbi Sacco says, so then it's not at all clear that we should waive it if going to mikveh is a real right. It's still a real possibility from health, and it's only private considerations that prevent you from doing that. Or there's other mikvaot you could go to that are only 20 miles away that do meet your health standards. None of all of these are dealing with the question of a public psak. What you tell specific people who are unable to go to mikveh because they are sick, but if they're sick, they probably shouldn't be having intimate relations anyway, but more likely because they're caretakers for people who are highly vulnerable. So Rabbi Amshalem, nobody in this volume addresses the question of what you tell individual people with complicated circumstances. And the reason for that, I think, is just because of the question of whether it's a good idea to discuss private circumstances in public, but also because in many of those circumstances, people will find other ways to make the tefillah unnecessary, or create it. Tell them to go to a natural body of water once, and then find ways to prevent themselves from becoming tameot again. So I don't think it's relevant to that. So the bottom line is, as I see it, and now I'll take questions. Bottom line, as I see it, is there is no contemporary halachic argument for allowing bathtub mikvaot in the absence of a general closure of the mikvahs. There might be space for talking. Right, we could wonder theoretically, and probably in Rabbi Amshalom's case, not so theoretically, but what we would say to specific people who are unable to go to mikvaot and tell us that they're unable to withstand the challenge of doing so. Although we wouldn't suggest it lechatchila, but what we tell them after the fact, and probably Rabbi Amshalem would go along with that. My suspicion, I have concerns about whether the research has been done to even meet that minimal standard. I see that Ari Bahar has all these questions about Sveika. Right. So all those rules are discussed in Uvacharta B'Chaim, and he discusses all those things. The outcome, as you can see from the Haskamot, is that nobody was convinced that he had found as far as I can tell, that he had found an actual halachic argument to say this is okay, as opposed to an argument saying that that this is what we have to do, even though under ordinary circumstances it would not just be b'diavad, but rather it would leave people in at least a position of Isur Rabbanan, and it's not just a lechatchila of accounting for other positions, or that might think it's Asur Deraita. All right, that's my summary. I don't think there's any contemporary justification for bathtub mikvaot as a general principle. I think that that my own sense is that even in private you would have to do a lot more research, but there hasn't been a discussion of individual cases as opposed to public cases anyway. Okay, questions? Right, so I see Shada's question. Showers, the conservative movement had issued a frankly odd psak suggesting showers I cannot. There's no way in Orthodox halacha that the argument they use has any traction. And honestly, they didn't claim it had any traction in anything resembling traditional halacha. It's based on an anthropological reconstruction of the original purpose of tefillah. There's no argument for showers at all. Um, and as I say, I don't think in any case, I don't think bathtubs are I don't think bathtubs are a real solution in the vast majority of cases. They're simply not big enough. Rabbi Amshalem says one of his grounds for heter is that maybe the Deoraisa principle is if you can fully immerse yourself in the bathtub, even if it's not the measure of 40 sa'ah, so for very small women. But I don't know, my bathtub at home, you would be hard pressed to get the average 12-year-old girl to be able to fully immerse themselves. Certainly not without the overflow tub. And once you're using somebody else's bathtub, so then you have, I don't know why somebody else's bathtub is safer than the communal mikveh. So I honestly don't see this as a very good solution. That's the short of it. But showers certainly don't work halachically in Orthodox halacha. Okay. Yes.
Question. So
Mm-hmm.
could you review briefly why, how could tap water be at all considered as water that's not drawn?
Well, so the reservoir is not right. The reservoir is a mikveh, right? Just that everybody agrees in the vast majority of cases, right? That reservoirs are fed by groundwater, and so they're perfectly kosher, kosher mikvehs. And so if all the pipes are firmly attached to the ground, and they're not intended and don't in practice contain water if they're held perfectly horizontally, and there are no tanks that have outlets above the basis, above the bottom of the tank, so they don't hold water. They don't hold water even if you close the taps, and as long as you leave there's still a hole in the bottom, or maybe there's no situation where there is a valve that actually disconnects the water from the reservoir. So then you could argue that tap water is enough.
Well, I guess maybe turn around. What is when you take a bucket of water from one place to another? What is it about that act that is the actual disqualification?
It's that it's been in a utensil and it has been poured directly from the utensil into the mikveh.
Okay, so pipes don't count as
horizontal pipes that are attached to the ground don't count. If they're not attached, right? So they might be a kli and davar makabel tumah anyway. But as long as they're fixed to a plumbing system, which is itself fixed to the ground, then they probably don't count for these purposes.
Okay, so they're saying like a pipe is like a ditch if it's in the ground.
Essentially
okay.
that.
Okay.
Good. As to Leia's question, absolutely. Absolutely. You could try to build a proper size mikveh, the Rabbi Miller suggests, if you had done the research about your own, making sure that you don't have a holding tank in your house that covers a kli, and that you've done the municipal research to know that there's nowhere in the water system that has the kind of pressure tanks that he's talking about, and you understand their pumping systems, right? I think it still requires a lot of research. Okay, other questions?
Yes, sorry. I don't know if this is such a practical idea, but could you, if you were to distill your own water and then have the distillation apparatus pour it directly into the
Sorry, can you talk louder, Ari? I'm having trouble hearing you.
Sorry. If you could distill your own water and have the distillation apparatus, pour it directly into the
So is distilled water the same as ice water, or is it rain?
Yeah, but basically, I'm saying it should be similar to rain, right?
That's a wonderful question, Ari. I don't have the faintest idea. That's a great question. There's all sorts of discussions about ice, but I have not seen any discussions about water distilled from vapor. It would take a lot to get 80 gallons of that.
Right. Yeah. It wouldn't be. It's not that practical, but it might be possible.
Right. That's very clever. That's very clever. Okay, Nathan, you can look at Rabbi Miller's book, and he'll talk about there's a suction pump, and I forget what the other kind is, and now we use something called he talks about a suction pump and a centrifugal pump, And the Cleveland system claims that I use something called peristaltic pumps. I am completely incompetent, and I'm not even going to bother.
Well, peristaltic pumps probably better because you're just squeezing the tube in such a way that it pushes the water along, as opposed to having something inside spinning around.
Could be. It could very well be. I just don't know. And there could be, that's what Cleveland talks about. It could be there are 6 other kinds of pumps that have been invented since 1938.
So my suspicion is that everyone except Cleveland uses centrifugal pumps.
They're going to be that peristaltic pumps are very hard to do at a very large scale.
It could be. It could also be the design of these pumps has changed in a way which is significant. Right? Miller has very detailed descriptions of how every pump works and why this is not an issue. And it could very well be that the designs of pumps are entirely different nowadays. I just wonder, again, I don't know plumbing at all. I know that.
Right. Well, I mean, I would think the key thing is if the pumping system's effectively continuous, then it's not a cleave. But if, let's say, they can imagine a certain kind of pump, a positive displacement pump, where the water is being moved from one end of the pump to another, is isolated at some point, and that isolation effectively corresponds to a cleave. And there are some things called piston pumps, which probably may be described as such.
Yeah, so Miller talks about the kind of piston pumps. Could be. I'll just point out also, by the way, other things. Again, I'm not a plumber, but I know that we have U-bends, right? U-bend traps designed to prevent the back influx of sewer gases, and U-bends are deliberately designed to always contain water, and so U-bends are definitely kalim. Right, and I haven't seen it.
That's only for the water. That's only on the way out, not on the way in.
So no water going in has ever flowed through a U-bend?
Right. They're basically designed so that the downstream of your sinks and toilets and such like that, the gases that would emanate from sewage water would not come back and up into the house, but the water coming in doesn't have that problem.
So that's only drain water. You don't think that water ever flows through those on an inlet?
I mean, you may have backflow preventers, which you have to look at their design, but that's to maintain the quality of the water in the town supply, so that there's no instance of water that was inside the house backing up back into the systems that's supplied to other people.
Okay, so again, I'm not a plumber. It seems to me that what I'm suggesting is, Miller wrote a book very detailed in 1938 based on his specific investigation. Rabbi Teleschkin wrote an even more detailed book based on extensive investigation of the New York City water supply system specifically. If we wanted to do this, I think that we'd have to do that research again. And so I guess what seems to me to be the case, very tentatively, is that this is not a very good suggestion for an immediate short-term solution. But if it looks like there, and we should be prepared for this, like everyone, like the same way the government should have been prepared for the pandemic. You have what we call a crisis. We need something like halachic crisis management teams, right? What would happen if it turned out that all our mikvaot, all public mikvaot, get closed down? It could have happened. We got lucky. We have a virus that dies in chlorinated water, right? But what happens if it turns out that we simply can't get mikvaot safe? So we should have a backup policy. Right, and so somebody should be out there investigating all the municipal water systems and discovering which neighborhoods it would be possible to build a private mikveh in your home, or whether it's possible to modify a bathtub in such a way. Maybe in the long term, it'd be good for the way we plan homes and from neighborhoods with 2 sinks and 2 dishwashers. Maybe building them with extra large bathtubs and easily closable outflow valves is a good idea in that system. But I think that this is much more in the realm of long-term planning than it is as immediate solution. That's my sense. Okay, other questions?
Yeah, I just want to clarify. Do you think that, according to Rav Amsalam's theory, the whole need for research into the water system isn't necessary because he's accepting that it's Maim Shuvim? He's just saying that's only the Rabbanan and goes from there. So there isn't really need to research the water, according to him.
That's probably that's an interesting question. Probably, although since Rabbi Amsalem is trying to build together, like he has 15 different solutions. Maybe it's not true of him. Maybe it is true of him, right? So I think you should still do the research, but you're right that probably Rav Amsalem would not require the research in the same way, because probably he would say the same thing anyway. Because fundamentally, yes, fundamentally he is, as long as you solve the problem of the mikveh itself being a kli, I think that he would be right. He would tell you to do this even if it's mayim shuvim. What I would say is like this: is that Rabbi Amshalam's heter is written for this extreme circumstance where there really is no other option. We are not in that circumstance. We're in a circumstance where the other options might have issues with them. So every little thing that you take, every little doubt that you add as to whether his heter works, probably makes it harder for it to apply in circumstances that are less than the absolute extreme. So yes and no, I guess, is the right. It's a great question. Yes and no. I think you should still do the research.
Right. It sounds to me, I don't know how you feel about this, all that verbiage at the front about when this applies, I was expecting the next line to be, and every time I say goyim, I mean those people who existed thousands of years ago and have nothing to do with today.
Yeah, so the question, right? The question is, does he mean it or not? Right? That's really the issue, right? Is he just protecting himself, or does he mean it? But I think if you look at the history of it, so my best guess, and I don't know him at all, is that he didn't originally write that. That if you look at the original Facebook post, he said, "I think this is what you should do," but he couldn't get anyone to agree. So in practice, right? He had to say this, and I don't, it might be that, I know there was a case recently where, where a friend of mine who's who's a posek, and has written some publicly controversial psakim, circulated a psak, and which was a little bit radical, and every one of his friends said, no, that just doesn't work, and so he withdrew it. Right? He didn't think it was false, but he withdrew it because he didn't think that it was a good idea to have a psak out there that even the people who normally are sympathetic with him don't wouldn't go along with it. So it could be that Rabbi Amsalem originally meant it one way. That would be my bet. And then after Dr. Abraham's response, he said no. Right. So Ashayna's question on the chat is exactly right. So again, Rabbi Amsalem talks about a very extreme circumstance where nobody has the option of going to mikveh. And that's because he's talking on a policy level, a legislative level. The question is right now, right, what about individual people? So the question of what the psak should be for individuals is not the same as the public question. And I don't think that I could speculate as to what Rabbi Amshalem's psak would be in those circumstances. I don't know. I can speculate as to what my response would be in those circumstances, but individual circumstances, you can do the research. So I think that would be, and again, and maybe it's possible, they could take Rabbi Miller, it's certainly possible for somebody to take Rabbi Miller's book and just build, even if your bathtub is not big enough, maybe you can buy, most bathtubs, you can buy attachable glass walls to make them hold a lot more water, right? So it might very well be possible in individual circumstances to turn a bathtub into a big enough mikveh, assuming, right, and to change your water heater if your water heater is an issue, or use only cold water. But I think the research would have to be done, and it hasn't been done. Okay. Further questions?
Is there any applicability maybe to situations which are not in the case of a pandemic, but let's say where a community can't have a standard mikveh like we assume is, the state of the art, halakhically anyway, that for most observant communities where you assume that the rain, for example, that it's going to rain frequently enough that you have enough rainwater, but you could say, okay, but we have groundwater and we can make a well. Can we take advantage of knowledge of how to design a system where it's clearly not going through a kli, to use that when there's not enough rain?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I think there's a case that's been mentioned publicly recently for a place in Canada that had no capacity for the kind of mikvahs that are standard in the United States, and I believe that prominent poskim suggested they use tap water, and that was fine. Another option which we haven't talked about is using melted ice. Right. So yeah, there are lots of ways. In circumstances where a community cannot have a mikveh within reasonable range, then I think it's really clear that that people will do the research into the municipal water system and try to allow tap water mikvaot, or alternatively, they'll try to allow melted ice mikvaot or melted snow mikvaot, or they'll do some combination of them, which is the most which is also likely. It's hard to transport that much ice. I think there's no question. What I've tried to get in both these shurim is that the tap water per se is not the issue that really is the holdup. The issue is the details of well, actually, I would say the reservoir water per se is not an issue because reservoirs are mikvahs. Right? The issues are the way in which the water gets from the reservoir to the tap, and that I think is a case by case issue. Even though b'diavad, that's a case by case issue. But when there's no other mikvah, people will certainly allow that if they've done the research enough. And the issue is the size and nature of the bathtub.
So a reservoir counts even if the water got there via a pumping system, which may like that's what's happening in Israel. That the water that comes up from the Kinneret is being pumped up to a reservoir at higher elevation. I don't know anything about the details of that pumping system, but let's say there's some aspect of it that can be considered a kli, but it's now in a reservoir from which there's distribution downhill to the rest of the country.
Right, so that's an interesting question. Once it went through a kli, I don't know that a reservoir, the reservoir would be just like a very big bathtub. It'd have all the same issues, but there would certainly be hamshacha. I suspect in practice that that the reservoir itself would certainly be a mikveh, but again, this is not my expertise, so I say suspect. I don't know enough about it. Right, and as Nathan says on the chat, entirely right, that A, I can't read blueprints, and B, who knows if people are telling you exactly the problem. When you get in conversations with people, so sometimes Rabbi Telushkin had a frum person who was embedded in the New York City War Department, I think, who was telling him everything. So, and that's great if you get it, but there are always risks that A, somebody will tell you what you want to hear, or B, that you get a person who has idiosyncratic or just wrong positions and doesn't understand his own department.
But nowadays, I think we have enough observant civil engineers that they could be hired as consultants to ask the right questions.
I think that's right.
And do an inspection on their own if given access.
I think that's right. There's always a risk. You have to pick the right ones. I always tell people about, that I don't know why people expect rabbis to be more competent on average than plumbers and electricians. Every field has its competent people and its not competent people. So you have to pick the right civil engineers. But yes, I think that just like you have to pick the right rabbis. But I think in principle we could do this. I think if we decide as a community now, and maybe it's happening, I hope it's happening. We decide as a community now that there is a non-trivial risk that a very significant number of women will have no access to a safe mikveh for an extended period of time. If that's we can look at it and say that in the United States, in a year from now, there are going to be, pick your number, 5,000 Orthodox women who have no access to a safe mikveh for the long term. Then we had better be doing the research to make sure that that we have an option for them, and it might be that the best option will be building Rabbi Miller Mikvaot. I would be fine by that. We should be doing the research. I would and it might be a whole new field the way that we have all these chemists now doing kashrut, and now we have and the Starkey has all its electricians or mechanic all its and product design people creating Shabbos modes. So it might be that there'll be a whole new market for halachic experts in hydraulics. We should be doing that, right? If we think there's a real risk, and it seems to me likely that there is a risk that a significant population. I don't think there's a risk of broad closures, but even that there's a risk. Maybe it's trivial, maybe it's non-trivial. I think we should be prepared for it because even if that isn't the risk for coronavirus, there's always the possibility that something else will come up, which is not easily susceptible to being killed by proper chlorination. So I think it's a good idea for halacha to have crisis management, teams thinking about these things, and I hope we're doing it. It shouldn't be me because I am really, really not good at understanding mechanical things. I tried to understand Miller's diagrams, and it goes the way of the bicycle repair book that I tried to read a year ago. It just doesn't. I don't translate diagrams into reality in my head. I don't understand how it works. Yeah, sorry.
Just with respect to hot water.
Need to talk up again, all right?
Oh, sorry. Like with respect to hot water, if you have
Yes.
a valid mikvah, are you allowed to pour non-kosher water?
Yeah, once the mikvah is valid.
Exactly.
Once the mikvah is valid, you can you can add whatever you want to it. But then once you break the connection, right, then you have to drain the mikvah, right, before you're restarting it. But once the mikvah is valid, then you can add to it whatever you want.
So if you were to have a big enough tub, right, and you were able to somehow fill it with cold tap water, assuming that the tap water was acceptable, could you then, assuming it was big enough to add extra water, could you just boil water or boiling water?
I guess in principle you should be able to, unless I'm missing something about whether that kind of thing works for a mikveh which is shuvin, which is non-shuvin but non groundwater in the first place. I guess it sounds to me, I wouldn't, I'm not betting on it because I really don't know. It sounds to me like I guess you should. But if you have if you have 80 gallons of cold water, and 80 is a minimal measure, right? Really, let's say there are 117 gallons of cold water. That's an awfully big bathtub that lets you add enough hot water to change the temperature substantially.
Yeah, but I guess there are like, I don't know, jacuzzis and, and things like that are common.
Maybe, really, 6-person hot tubs. Yeah. Right? But you can, once you're at it, you can just put a heater in, right?
Yeah, I guess so.
Right? If you have a hot tub has its own heater, right? So once we're making them custom made, right, for large houses in Jewish neighborhoods, we're fine. Right? The question is how many. We also should take into account people living, and particularly for the mikvah, right? For the people who use mikvaot, they're likely to be living in small apartments in the New York area, right? So they're not going to be able to install 6-person hot tubs in their apartments, and the renters, they're moving a lot, right? So you want. Right, Miller's whole advertising was that his mikvaot only cost $5, and then he had a portable version. In the end, he produced a fabric version that was a pop-up mikvah that you could take with you. Right? So we'd have to construct all those things again if that were the case. Yeah, I think it's all possible. Okay. All right, I take it that's it then. Thank you everybody for participating as always. There's tomorrow at 12 again. We're doing the attempt to deal with at least one hard issue of triage, and yeah, hopefully we'll learn together again soon. Thank you very much.